Hello, and thanks for joining us for this Roamby webinar discussion. My name is Scott Hurley, and I will be your host and moderator today. In this webinar, we will be discussing how to win in the new normal with smart supply chain decisions. Our speakers today are Wolfgang Lamacher, former head of supply chains at the World Economic Forum, and he's joining us from Hong Kong, as well as Sanjay Sharma, co-founder and chief executive officer at Roamby, who is joining us from Silicon Valley, USA. Wolfgang will share with us the pillars for success in the new normal, and Sanjay will share the practical tips and tools that will help you win in the new normal. We will also attempt to answer your questions, so please keep sending them in using the questions field on your screen, which you should be able to see. So let's get started with a quick anonymous poll. The question we'd like you to answer is, what aspect of supply chain management is more important for you today? Is it resilience or is it performance? You've got 30 seconds to send in your answers, starting now, so go. Okay, so thank you for everyone who submitted an answer, and looking at the poll results, it looks like it's almost 50-50, resilience and performance. Certainly we'll be talking about both of those today. So again, thank you. Now let's get started with the main discussion, and we'll start with you, Wolfgang. Again, thank you for joining us. Could you please walk us through the shift from resilience to performance and the pillars for success in what we are calling the new normal?
Thank you very much, Scott, and thanks to everybody who joins us today. And I'm always very excited to talk about winning, and I think everybody likes to win. And in supply chain, winning is related to smart decisions. And smart decisions are needed every day because in supply chain there is every day a new surprise, a new disruption, and that has to be managed. And in the new normal, I think that problem-solving skills and capabilities have never been more important. But what is the new normal? In the new normal, I think the COVID-19 outbreak lies behind us. And what do I mean with that? I talk about the outbreak because the virus will stay with us, I think, for some time. Although we don't like the idea, but I think we have to accept that as a new reality. And in that light, I want to say that the new normal has arrived. And opposed to what I've said 4 or 5 months ago, where I was focusing more on the short term and the fixes, the overcoming of the tremendous new hurdles, now I think that time has come to accept that volatility and uncertainty is part of our life, and that we need to invest and start to be able to manage in such times, meaning to be operational with the presence of the factors I have mentioned before. And when it comes to resilience versus performance, my view is that resilience is a part of performance. It is all about performance when it comes to supply chain. It is all about living up to the promise we have given to our customers. We can make the supply chain more resilient. We can put more buffers into the supply chain. We can have spare trucks, spare planes. But why are we not doing this? Or we do it in a very limited scale, because it comes as a very high cost. And therefore, I think we need to use technology and make smart decisions and find smart strategies to come to a lean resilience approach. And smart decisions and winning in that context is exactly about that. It's not about doing the obvious and building factories and leave them 50% idle, or have enormous stocks. We need some of that, and we had it. And supply chains are always carrying a lot of inventory. But when it comes to smart resilience, smart performance, smart supply chains, encompass all what we know as supply chain professionals, which is resilience, which is efficiency, which is agility, etc. Then I think in the fourth industrial revolution, and that is the era we are living in, it is all about technology. And the smart decisions are around what is the right technology to use to have that high performance supply chain, a supply chain of excellence, a supply chain of leadership. And in this context, I would like to elaborate on three pillars, which I find are characteristic for today's times. And the three are remote working, accelerated planning, and instant decision making. And why do I talk about remote? Remote has become as a synonym, as a word, as a term for working in times of COVID-19, because many governments have asked the people to go home and stay there, and we had not a lot of alternatives. We had to work remotely, and we did very well. But it's not only about remote working as a traditional office task. It is also about remotely monitoring things, remotely fulfilling tasks which have been done with human labor before. And then the second take on COVID-19 is about planning. I think that the successful companies have done planning innovation, which means moving away from 13-week cycles to maybe a 4-week, 3-week cycle. Because in volatile times and with the disruptions we have seen, or the limitations we have seen, for example, the limitation in air cargo capacity, the closures of essential or critical infrastructure, we had to deal with a lot of uncertainty, and therefore the planning cycles had to be reduced. And the more data people had at hand, the smarter their decisions were. And the third pillar is about the instant decision making. And it's also not a new phenomena, but in times of high volatility, it's very important to act immediately. And there are or have been a lot of surprises along the way where ships have been turned away, containers couldn't be unloaded, and instant decisions had to be made to avoid that customers end up disappointed. Next slide, please. Diving a little bit in remote working. So remote working in the time of COVID-19 was primarily around protecting the workforce. But there is more than safety, and it's also not a new topic, because we know remote operating, for example, in ports, where we remotely can operate terminals to load and unload ships. And the idea to push remote working further is also a common topic. And I stay within the maritime supply chain. For example, the autonomous ships, which are permanently discussed, are remotely controlled ships. And the idea behind that is not only to protect people, it is in fact to increase performance, to increase efficiency, to increase productivity. And when I take the autonomous ship, definitely it can be more fuel efficient. If I take the aspect of productivity, one captain can in parallel navigate 4 or 5 ships and not only one. So in addition, the whole remote idea is at the center or at the core of the Internet of Things. And that brings us very close to the visibility discussion within supply chains. Then there is the aspect of having dashboards, having the ability to control production sites in India, in Mexico, in China, remotely from any place in the world, in the US, in Europe, in Asia. And this is another aspect which has become much more popular and present in supply chain management over the last years. And when we think about remote, we also have to think about the aspect of cybersecurity. And why that? Especially when people work from home, it is very difficult, or much more difficult, to ensure cybersecurity in an environment where devices are distributed, where people log in from their home, but maybe also from taxis or from launches. It's much more difficult. So when we talk about the topic of remote management, this is clearly an aspect of this. And next slide, please.
I think there is also sort of an angle about remote control towers, Wolfgang, when we think about remote working.
Yeah, and yeah, you're absolutely right. And with when we think about the mobile enterprise, we can today have probably the control tower we had 10 years ago in our pocket on our smartphone, and with the ability to pass on and push information. Absolutely right. So I spoke already about the accelerated planning, and what remote and the Internet of Things brought to us was in fact a lot of data, because everything works through data. Visibility means data. And so when we talk about supply chains, we very often use the term OTIF, on time and in full. And I used it here in the data context. We need end-to-end visibility. We need data on time and in full. And that creates us the comfort we need in whatever environment and whatever time we are operating. And with the data comes another challenge. So we are moving ahead and developing more and more tools in supply chain management. But for example, the dream of visibility can turn easily into a nightmare of data, because how can we handle all this data? And there we need analytics. We need tools which allow us in real time to analyze situations and drive decision making. So we need a constant cleansing of data, constant categorizing of data, and constant analysis of data. And that helps us to permanently analyze what is happening in the supply chain. For example, we can do partner benchmarking. We can see in real time where are or whether there are deviations from agreed service level agreements. And in this, not only to just react and in that situation, but also as a starting point to improve the performance of individual partners and the pool of partners as a whole. Because if we measure the performance of individual partners and operators, trucks, warehouses, we are able to drive towards supply chain management, supply chain leadership, supply chain excellence. And in the times of COVID-19, this comes also with another benefit, because we have to experiment a lot. We have to investigate alternative lanes. And of course, it's again data which helps us to evaluate alternative lanes, to compare lanes, to see what works better. But whom do I tell that? Because the audience is full of seasoned supply chain professionals. But that's my whole topic of planning. So with data, I can convert planning, in fact, or enhance it by experimenting. Next slide, please. Yeah, and I have already said several times, instant, real time. And that is another very important aspect in today's supply chain management. It is the fact, or driven by the fact, that yesterday's data might be worthless. So we need to have the ability to be constantly connected and to receive constant data and to analyze this data. But now we go one step further and talk about early warning signals. We don't want to be forced to deal with a problem when the damage has already been done or happened. We want to be informed that there is a risk that something could happen. And that's, for me, the ultimate supply chain tool is, in fact, predicting, and some even go a step further and say prescripting, but predicting what is really happening in the supply chain. And we see this in the space of aviation or automotive, where you can have predictive maintenance. Here we talk about predictive errors. And then the next step is that it should not only go to one person. The boss knows that there might be a problem. The information about a potential disruption, of a potential deviation, should be pushed to an entire team, to all people that are potentially positive contributors to the problem solving, so to all relevant stakeholders. And of course, the variations in conditions are in particular important in pharma supply chains, in healthcare supply chain, when we talk about vaccines, medicine, also human organs, then it becomes critical. And this means these goods have to stay within certain temperature ranges. And the key to temperature controlled logistics excellence is the use of monitoring systems that provide tracking and tracing, but also cold chain data from the first mile to the last mile in real time. And that's probably the queen of all supply chains, what I'm talking about now. And when it comes to a deviation from plan, then again, the predictive element is very important. When suddenly goods are stored which should move, then the information should go to the people so that they can investigate and take the necessary actions. And the last point, before I stop and hand over back to Scott, is about recommendation engines. So we we talked about the real time, the shortening of planning, even predictive analytics. But still, up to this point, people still have to work on solutions. But when we use analytics and recommendation engines, we come to the stage where the machines give us options. And we see a time when the machines get that well that we can automate the processes. And we will clearly start with simple steps and simple problems, but there will be a path towards much more complex decision making. But I don't want to stay and finish on a pure technology point, but also say that COVID-19 has shown that the human factor is very important. Our engines were sometimes not made for such high volatility. And if I see what the supply chain professionals have done over the last 5 to 6 months is fantastic. Wherever a system failed us, humans stepped in with their experience and their relationships. And that is also how I envision the future. It's the hybrid, it's the collaboration between very powerful machines and very experienced and highly skilled professionals. It is a bit like a plane. The pilot takes over when the storm hits the route. And my last comment is, but if you don't have instruments in the plane, the only chance you have is to ground it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Wolfgang. That was very insightful. For those of you in the audience, please keep sending through your questions. We'll try to answer as many as we can in the Q&A round at the end of this session. First, we have another quick anonymous poll. And this time, the question we'd like you to answer is, where do you see your biggest smart decision opportunity in the new normal? This is a multiple choice question, so please select all these choices that are relevant, to include managing warehouse inventory and compliance, benchmarking transport partners, evaluating new lanes rapidly, sensing demand signals early, and or reacting faster to conditioned excursions. So again, you'll have another 30 seconds to submit your answer. Okay, Ade, I think that should be enough time for people to have answered. Let's take a look at the results if we have them. Okay, it looks like a pretty good selection across the board. Definitely the one that the most people answered is reacting faster to conditioned excursion, and that makes sense, especially in today's environment. So very useful input. Thank you very much. So thank you for those that submitted an answer. And now, Sanjay, could you walk us through your top tips and tools for realizing the opportunities in winning in the new normal, to build on what Wolfgang talked about? What
Sure.
those opportunities would be?
Sure, Scott. Thank you everyone for joining this session. Thanks, Wolfgang, for giving us a view of where the new normal is. Next slide, please. I think when we talk about when you look at the polls, it is very clear that the supply chain cannot be reactive, but it has to be very proactive. And of course, the unbroken chain of custody concept is a holy grail. And what we have seen is in the last 3 months, when the COVID-19 began, there was a complete pause in everybody's supply chain. The companies that recovered, it's a very interesting data that we have seen, the companies that recovered faster were able to stitch together the limited chain of custody data that they had. We have seen examples where there were lockdowns in many parts of the world, and transporters and goods were just at a standstill. And the companies that basically knew about the location and the condition of their shipments in various parts of the world, and the ability to stitch together various data, whether it's coming from their transporters, whether they're coming from their own supply chain teams, they were able to move these goods to a safer location, to a location where it could have a lesser spoilage risk or a damage risk, and be able to deliver to their customers. It's very interesting. So when we talk about supply chain integrity, the first thing that comes to mind is basically looking at tightening the control of visibility itself. And few customers come to our mind. There are companies like IFCO. They are in the business of returnable containers. You have companies like Marken, who move pharma products around the world. You have companies like British American Tobacco, who are also moving their own products around the world. It was very clear that these companies, when they started looking at using visibility for tightening control, a lot of them basically realized the first thing is basically to know where things are. And all these companies basically have implemented solutions where they know by location, what their inventory of goods and assets are. And if these assets happen to be reusable containers, these assets could be trailers, these assets could be just simple pallets, and the material that is needed to move these products together. One of the things that we have learned through these customers and the customer insights have been, one, looking at the inventory of their goods and assets at various locations, ability to predict when these goods and assets are going to get be run out at these locations, and ability to forecast from where these things would be recycled. Then there are companies like Glaxo. Imagine Wolfgang talked about SLAs and implementations of these SLAs. It's a very classic case study in case of GlaxoSmithKline. They have about 6,000 different transporters all around the world. They have SLAs. SLAs talk about the fact that transporters can only move their goods from dawn to dusk. They have to take highways most of the time. They cannot stop 200 miles from origin and 200 miles from destination. So these are very classically documented, and I'm sure you guys also have some sort of SLAs with the transporter. One thing that came out very clear is how do you basically enforce some of these SLAs? And companies like Glaxo has embraced IoT and data analytics combined together to up their game, improve their SLAs with the transporters, and also to maintain a culture of transparency. What would come out from this initiative at Glaxo is not about monitoring the health of the goods, whether it's cold chain or non-pharma, but it is also basically looking at improving and uplifting the partner. Gone are the days when you start thinking about penalizing the partner for not meeting the SLA. Because if you don't see what's happening in your supply chain, you can't control it. So one of the recommendations here, as we start thinking about the new normal, is to automate, implement visibility solutions in various parts of your supply chain. Start thinking about enabling your workforce, your suppliers' workforce, your partners' workforce with that data. and translate that data into improvements. And that basically, at the end of the day, will result in a lot of customer trust. I want to share something that a very large hardware manufacturer, electronic consumer hardware manufacturer implemented. When they started looking at lane analytics and lane visibility, they found that some lanes are much better than others. Other lanes, they realized through the data that they were collecting from the sensors on their shipments, they realized that some lanes are quite bumpy and not good for the products that they are moving, resulting in a lot of RMAs, resulting in a lot of shipments that were delivered in a damaged condition. And the thing that they implemented using sensor technology and the new supply chain technologies that Wolfgang talked about is basically to deliver their data back to the partners. And the result of that was, even though some lanes took a day longer, they were much safer lanes. So it is not always about reducing cost. It is about quality of delivery. It is about on-time delivery. It is about making sure in a larger scheme of things, the cost even out if you have a much better control and the chain of custody on your products. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is a very interesting topic. Wolfgang touched to some parts of it. How do you basically, start thinking about getting started in improving your supply chain operations? And 9 out of 10 times in my conversations with a lot of supply chain executives in companies, they are often having a much more larger blueprint of digital transformation. And digital transformation could be company-wide. Digital transformation could be very specific to a warehouse or a distribution center, or just a part of the business that is not effective and not efficient. And oftentimes, my conversations have been about how do you get started? And one of the things that we have learned, engaging with, over 300 plus customers now globally, is a recipe to success. One thing that what we have seen and encouraged our customers to do is start looking at EDIs. Even though EDI is a time-delayed notification system, even though you have parts of your fleet, your partner's fleet having GPS trackers, let's start with that. Bring that data into some form or shape on a map. So imagine now you have a sort of a dashboard with all the historical EDI data as well as the data that's on shipments that are in transit. Marry that with GPS data if you have them, and you will start seeing a pattern of the delays, not only in the notifications, also the quality of the data. One thing that we have seen is, most times when some of our pharma customers are shipping their products from one part of the world to the other part of the world, the notification or the acknowledgement that the journey has begun or the shipment is in transit actually occurs when the shipments have already been delivered. What I mean by that is a lot of these data are time delayed and not actionable. And most time when I talk to supply chain executives, they often faced with 3 types of problems. And there's, as I said, there is a pattern to actually benchmarking the supply chain operations here. The first scenario they paint is they have some lanes that are performing better than others. So how do you basically, for example, the products going from California to Denver, is not performing as well as other lanes. And that's sort of a starting point to inject sensors. And then there are other scenarios where a particular SKU is a problem SKU. It's possibly a 60-inch TV is getting damaged more often than the other SKUs, and that's another area where you want to start thinking about injecting sensors so you can really start analyzing these SKU patterns. And lastly, what I've also seen is an unsatisfied customer. So you are shipping your products to Best Buy, or you're shipping your products to a pharmacy, or any of your customers around the world, and they are not very happy because you are always missing your deadlines. What you say are not trusted data. So there is a lot of friction in your supply chain to begin with. And my recommendation to a lot of these executives has been to start small. Start by injecting sensors. And when I talk about injecting sensors, I mean by, basically all shipments going from California to Denver should have a tracker on those shipments. All 60-inch TV SKUs that are basically going from point A to point B should carry a sensor. Or all shipments going to a Walmart or going to a CVS should have those sensors. And what will happen through this exercise is you will start lighting up various parts of the supply chain. And this will enable you to identify the glitches that exist in your supply chain. And what will happen is once you started looking at these patterns, it could be a 1-month initiative, it could be a 2-month, it could be a 3-month, but the exercise that you do will result in certain efficiencies and inefficiencies spots in your supply chain. And take that and translate into data that will work for you. For example, like the many of the customers that we talk to would basically enable 100% of the shipments on those lanes, and they will find that those lanes are not efficient as they thought they would be. It could be a combination of transporter issues, it could be a combination of route or lane issues, it could be even a problem with the timing or the days that you start your shipments. And this benchmark performance data is very critical to start thinking about the new normal. I have been talking to one of the customers in our portfolio, and each time they basically, when the COVID happened, there were lockdowns in Southeast Asia. Goods were typically being moved in the pre-COVID days through land from Singapore to Malaysia. And when the lockdown happened, they started moving their goods through flight. And they found that it was, even though it was more costly to move those products across the two countries through air, they were able to recover the cost of that extra transportation because of the speed and the efficiency of delivery that happened in their supply chain. All of that resulting into operational efficiency. So my recommendation is, you have to start with things that you can't see. There are different kinds of sensors that are available that you should start looking at, and just start thinking about taking a small footprint of your supply chain and lighting up with these new technologies. Next slide, please. Yeah, so sensing demand signals early, I saw the poll here. There was a lot of interest on how we do that. And Wolfgang did talk about at a very macro level why it's important. If you were to step back, and I'm sure you will resonate with my thought process here, is demand signals often were basically trend based. So you look historically in the past, and you start looking at cycles of demand in the last 3 years, the last quarter at the same time last year, and many of those variations, and you start predicting. One thing that comes out very important is if you want to shift your supply chain to be lean resilient. And what I mean by lean resilient, which Wolfgang also talked about, is the ability to act very nimbly in a very agile fashion. The first thing that you need to start thinking about is how do you get the POS data? And there has been a lot of talk, there has been a lot of implementations where the normal trend has been in the pre-COVID days to hardwire POS information at stores, at forward dealer locations with your ERP or your backend system. And some companies have done it well, but now when you start looking at redesigning or shifting of the supply chain network, some are moving their dealer locations from one place to the other, some are moving their distribution centers, some are even moving their manufacturing infrastructure. It is physically impossible to start hardwiring or rewiring some of this stuff. So how do you basically get your smallest distributor or your smallest forward location enabled so that you know how much inventory they are carrying, how much inventory has been sold, and things like that. What comes to mind is a very interesting customer of ours, Interstate Batteries. They have 100,000 auto repair shops around the country who basically move their car battery products. And some are large, some are small. It's a classic problem. I don't know how many batteries they are carrying. I don't know how many batteries they have sold in a day. And I can't really hardwire their POS with mine because infrastructurally it is not possible. Second is also looking at inventory movement. I mean, I am basically holding a lot of battery inventory at my mother warehouse, and I need to push this to forward locations. How many of them I ship, what's my schedule of shipping, and things like that. We have been working with companies like Interstate Batteries, for a larger part of 1 year now. And one of the things that we have done is using sensors, and that's sort of where the balance of sensor technology and product comes into play. Each battery carries a sensor. Every time a battery is on a shelf, it lights up and tells you the inventory at each repair store that carries the Interstate Batteries. When these batteries are sold, the sensors get removed, and that becomes a trigger for knowing that the amount of battery that has been sold through the supply chain. And then there is a replenishment fact. Now imagine with the data that you have here, which is inventory on shelf, inventory that is sold, you can almost do real-time replenishment or predict the replenishment in the future by store, by zip code, by city, by state. And that's that's a hard problem that most of the companies have that we have embarked on solving. One recommendation and one learning that I have through this exercise is to separate the real signals from the noise. And it's not easy. What I mean by that is you will see a difference in the physical count of, in this case, the physical count of your inventory compared to the signals you're getting from the sensors, compared to the quantity and the type of products you have in your ERP. On day one, they all will be very different. So one key aspect to implementing a successful demand sensing initiative is start thinking about what signals really matter to you on day one, because cleansing of signals is a very tough initiative. It cannot be done on day one. So the things that I recommend to supply chain leaders and executives is to start thinking about the signals that matter. For some, the signal of electronic proof of delivery would matter more than demand, or buffer inventory would matter more than. So identify those signals up front and start separating those signals from the noise. The other aspect of demand signal has also been trigger demand workflows. What I mean by that is a lot of customers have started to automate. When Wolfgang talks about automation, automation is where your sensors are triggering the workflows or the processes within your ERP. Let's take an example of this battery use case. The fact that the number of batteries at a particular location has dropped under 50 triggers a process of reordering. Or the fact that your shipment has reached a destination and it is in good quality as per the sensor readings, and the fact that I know that they have been delivered in a geofence which happens to your destination, you can trigger an invoicing process. So a lot of our customers have embarked to start pushing the envelope of not only using sensor for track and trace, but actually automating some of the workflows. And obviously the result has been, improvements in forecasting and improvements in demand accuracy. Next slide, please.
Hey, Sanjay, before you get to the last slide, I just want to remind you, we have about 3 minutes before you want to move to the Q&A session.
Good. And last but not the least here is the early warning system, right? And it's quite interesting. The control tower a lot of the customers have today, all of that is now remote. So one of the things that we like to emphasize is to start thinking about the control tower, which was very people-centric and very reactive, very phone-based, very email-based, to start step back and thinking about how these control towers can be redesigned and empowered with analytical data. And that's sort of what this slide talks about here, is to achieve that through data gathering. One of the things that we have learned is if we can push the real-time data as it occurs within your supply chain and put them on the fingertips of each and every individual in your supply chain ecosystem, the decision making will be much faster, it will be more proactive, and it will build a lot of customer trust that is needed in times of today. And last but not the least is starting to think about contingency planning, which is sort of the hardest part here. And it's quite iterative. It's not something that's a slam dunk and you can do it in a week or 10 days or a month. My recommendation here has been to a lot of customers to start thinking about, once you have developed a culture where you're pushing data on the fingertips of your workforce and giving recommendations and choices on what decisions they need to make, they're the ones who will give you the feedback on what those consultancy planning should look like. So that's my last slide. Thank you very much. Scott, back to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Sanjay. So there's still time for people to ask questions, and especially based on all the great material that Wolfgang and Sanjay have provided so far today. Before we get to the Q&A, though, we do want to have one final anonymous poll. And the question we'd like you to answer, please, is where would visibility add the most value in your supply chain? Again, multiple choice, so choose all the ones that resonate with your goals, to include operational efficiency, customer satisfaction, demand sensing, on-time and full delivery, security and compliance, and shipment safety. So I'll give you, again, another 20, 30 seconds to answer, please. Okay, let's see our results. Okay, again, pretty good distribution. Certainly operational efficiency appears to be the one that was selected by the most participants. Sanjay or Wolfgang, any thoughts on the answers that we see here?
Yeah, I mean, this is no different than what we have seen in the last 3 months, Scott. Operation efficiency has multiple facets, workforce efficiency, optimization of supply chain networks, and also just around visibility within the inventory and the demand. So it's in line with most of the leaders that are thinking about.
And we see number 2 is security and compliance for shipment safety. I'd be curious to compare how that is today versus it would have been 4 months ago, and whether or not that's actually become a bigger concern.
Wolfgang, what are your thoughts? I mean, I may be biased here. You're on mute, Wolfgang.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all. Operational efficiency is at the heart of every supply chain management book, right? We want to bring costs down and also deliver the standard we have committed to. I also believe that security and compliance was always an important topic because it represents the risk side. So no real surprises, because on time in full is a specific aspect. I believe that demand sensing will grow because in importance, because it drives revenue. So what you explained, Sanjay, about the sensors on products in store, when you know exactly what sells at what speed, where's the acceleration of sale, and then look at groups and correlate the different products, then you can come to a much more sophisticated approach in supply chain management. But yeah, and this will be an important factor in the next 6 to 18 months to drive sales. And this is also the next generation of supply chain management, which is about integrating supply chains from the customer end. And with the customer information, then you can better plan your warehouse capacity, you can better plan your transport capacity, and you can even get better financing if you provide the banks with information about your current and future sales in that level of granularity.
Great, thanks, Wolfgang. Okay, so on the Q&A side, I will paraphrase some of the questions just to make it easy to answer. But the first one I thought was most interesting is that a lot of the technologies that have been mentioned are not new and have had mixed success so far. So what's different about today, what's different about now, and how these technologies can help from an adoption and leverage standpoint to be successful and perform?
Yeah, I think, Scott, what has happened is the technology itself is becoming cheaper and very accessible. You look at RFID, 4-5 years ago, just infrastructurally, RFID was very, very expensive to deploy and implement. And the returns on that infrastructure were not very, very great. You were not getting the accuracy. So there has been a shift from infrastructure-centric visibility technologies to infrastructure-less. And with the advent of new technologies like cellular, Bluetooth, NB-IoT, the shift from infrastructure to infrastructure-less has accelerated the adoption. And when you start thinking about marrying some of these infrastructure-less technologies with other software platforms, may it be a ERP at the back end, maybe a logistics platform for visibility. You can now start deriving much more better analytics faster at a lower cost of ownership than what it was possible earlier.
Great.
My view is when you ask me what has changed, COVID-19 has accelerated a lot of trends, and amongst others, the adoption of technology. What I expected to see happening at the beginning of the year over the next 5 years has in fact happened over the last 5 to 6 months. So what I mean with that is it became so obvious how important technology is because we entered with COVID-19 to an enormous experiment. What also will change, and building on what Sanjay has said, because cost is always a barrier, but there is another barrier which is resistance, inertia, and the ease of use package, which always plays a role, and people are a bit let's say, resistant to a lot of change and new things. But COVID-19 made that clear, but there's also the new generation. There are the digital natives, and they use the tools very easily. They grow up with them. They take the parents' iPhone at the age of 5 and manage it maybe better at 6 than the parents themselves. So what is important there is that the providers have to also adapt to that situation and bring new tools, not the heavy tools, the tools people, the new generation of workforce is used to.
Wonderful. So the next question is really interesting. It's a little bit long, so I'll try to summarize it. But what is your view, and Wolfgang, if you could answer this first, your view on stress testing supply chain, either from a mandatory standpoint, from governmental regulation, or from a voluntary standpoint, in terms of the practicality of how that can be done in real life, and is it something that should be done with a parallel of what happened in the banking crisis of 2008, where government started to introduce stress testing for these big banks to make sure that they can actually work, especially now when we're talking about critical products, the ability to move those across the globe.
So in principle, I like the idea. Conceptually, I like the idea. The concern I have, or the comment I would like to make is that COVID-19 was the biggest stress test we ever had. And I would like to re-emphasize that in fact what worked were the supply chains. And this under so adverse conditions, right? We had all the constraints I mentioned before. Governments forced us to close factories. We lost 40% of our air cargo capacity due to the flight cancellations and the bans. We had stuff turned away, and nevertheless, we had constant panic buying created by fake news, etc. And nevertheless, yes, in the afternoon there was maybe a shortage in the supermarket, but next morning the shelves were full again. So and I also believe that the supply chains will not change that much, and it's not all about China. If I look at BMW produces 400,000 vehicles in the United States and exports them to 125 countries. They will not change that. There is a reason why things are as they are. So when it comes to stress testing, I think what we need to work on is to stress test our global alignment in terms of the definition of essential workforces, the programs we can think of in terms of aligning in terms of crisis, in situation of crisis. When it comes to essential goods and the shortages of masks and PPE, which is the personal protection equipment, and this is the part of the question as well. We are dealing with a peak situation, and we don't expand the New York subway after every 4th of July because we had a peak, or after every Thanksgiving and Black Friday, right? So the topic, the solution is not the stress testing here. because we cannot leave. I don't know what the mask demand is. Is it 2x, 4x, 10x of what we usually have? We will not have 90% of capacity either. The solution lies in flexibility, in agility, in the ability to refurbish factories, in the ability to get more transparency about where the world's factories are of critical goods or essential goods. And these essential goods can be different in the next crisis. We don't know what the next crisis is. I have seen a lot. I have seen SARS, I have seen the Asian financial crisis, I have seen the GFC, I have seen the volcano crisis, the Iceland volcano outbreak, and Fukushima, Thailand flooding, Kobe earthquake. And every time we had a different hit, different products. So we cannot easily stress test supply chains and prepare them for such a crisis, because we don't know where we will be hit, in what way, what products will we need. So we need to have maximum visibility and maximum flexibility in the supply chain, and we need the support of the governments as well.
Great, thank you, Wolfgang. I think I know we're up over the hour limit. We could ask one more question. If people want to drop off, they're welcome to. If they want to stay, they can. Certainly, for those of you that asked questions that were not answered, we will answer those offline. But I did want to ask one more. Sanjay, this is for you as someone who has been running a large remote team for the last several months, but especially from a supply chain standpoint. What is your point of view about remote assignment of work and task to resources, as opposed to not remote monitoring?
Yeah, I think it's always been a challenge to change the culture, especially when specifically in the industries that we work in. Team and collaboration and everybody being under one roof to move products or to manage demand and to fulfill orders is the norm. One thing that we have done and done very well is to realign our teams towards objectives. And this is no different than what we see with companies that have realigned themselves in the new world of supply chain. Partly basically bringing a lot of transparency, as I mentioned in my useful tips, putting data on the fingertips of each and every team member, whether it's within Rombi or outside of Rombi, ability to train the workforce to start thinking about how to act on those information and data. Because when Wolfgang talks about recommendation engines, the recommendations that come out of the data analytics may not be very solid in the initial months of operations, because the algorithms have to learn itself, they have to mature, and then the prediction will be much more closer to the truth. So in those times, basically, there is a way and to navigate the workforce to start thinking about results than thinking about action on the data itself. And lastly is basically the trust between your partners, trust between your co-workers, creating the trust environment with your customers. And all of that can only happen through much more transparent way of operation, much more transparent way of bringing information to various parties who have their own inspirations to use that data for their own benefit. And the job's not done yet. We are seeing a lot of change in mindset and realignment. And I feel that the new normal, like it or not, will enforce a lot of transparency within various parts of the organization, between organizations, and with our customers and partners.
Great, thanks, Sanjay. Okay, we can wrap up now. Wolfgang, do you have any parting thoughts or any one last thing you'd like to leave the audience with?
No, I only want to thank you for the moderation and the audience for participating in the new normal, because webinars are also part of the new normal.
Right. Sanjay, any closing words?
No, Scott, I think it was a good seminar here, and I just enjoyed answering a lot of good questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So thank you both for your insights, and thank you so much to the audience who joined us today. You will receive a link to access a handbook where you can dive deeper into the insights and tips that we talked about today. That's all for the webinar. Thank you to everyone. Enjoy your day or evening, depending on where you are in the world.